I'm joined now by Niambi Carter. She's an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Niambi, thanks so much for your time. What are the lessons learned from this pivotal moment in history?
Well, thank you, Sally. I think the one thing we have to remember is that rights aren't easily granted. I mean, by the time that King and the other 250,000 marchers got to Washington in 1963, I mean, this had been a 100-year fight for basic civil rights and justice. So I think one of the key lessons is that the fight for justice isn't complete until everyone can reach the full measure of their humanity. And that's what King was talking about in 1963. But I also think one of the key lessons here is that progress takes time. It's a very slow march. And so you're really here for a marathon and not a sprint. And so while it looked like lots of things happened after 1963, it'd been because of these very long periods of organizing when it didn't look like much was going to happen or that there was much to hope for Black people on the national horizon.
Let's talk about affirmative action and how it's evolved over the years. Diversity initiatives in businesses and schools have come under attack, as well as the inclusion of race and other identities in education. How do you think such efforts to restrict lessons on race affect, or even, the opportunities for people of colour or minorities affect MLK's legacy?
Well, listen, I think these are legacies not just of MLK, but all those people who fought. I mean, Martin Luther King was the person at the top of the marquee, but there were lots of people, women in particular, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, folks like Bayard Rustin, who was a queer activist of the time, who were there also making this event happen and who were participating. And I think when we take these lessons out of schools and when we try not to talk about these things, one, I think we truncate who we are and what our possibilities are as people and as a nation when we don't talk about these really, I think, difficult subjects, but necessary subjects. I also think we forestall really sort of robust conversations about what justice and equality and civil rights actually can look like. Affirmative action is one way to address those things, right? It's one potential remedy, but it's not the only one that people can envision. Even in King's speech, he talked about everything from militarism to poverty to jobs creation and employment, education, civil rights. I mean, this was a really robust vision for the future of not just Black America, but America. And I think we potentially will lose that when we sort of distill him down to the very ends of that very beautiful, eloquent speech, and when we take these kinds of lessons out of schools.
As you said, so many elements of identity come out of a day like today, LGBT community, religious communities, immigrant, native, indigenous peoples, but these are also issues and subjects that have propelled bills in state legislatures across the country. But of course, debate over these issues is intensifying now that we're gearing up to the 2024 presidential cycle, especially among the conservative circles. How do you think the civil rights movement applies to the current age of culture wars? What are the conversations that are toxic in the way that we're talking about it?
Well, I think the main one for me is the fact that equality for one group or the inclusion of one group means a loss for another group, particularly whites. When you've had everything most of the time, or you've had a lot of privilege, anything that chips away at that feels like a loss. But it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. One of the things we know about affirmative action programs, one of the things we know about sort of inclusive education and other types of efforts at diversity is that it makes us all better. We become smarter. We become more thoughtful. We become more empathetic. I mean, affirmative action not just helped Black people, it also helped women. It also helped Asians. It helped a lot of different kinds of people who weren't necessarily considered as part of the constituency that is civil rights. I mean, when we talk about the Voting Rights Act, as you all talked about just a moment ago, in the Civil Rights Act, that also included indigenous people, people with limited English proficiency, right? These people who would not traditionally be considered part of that conversation were part of that big tent. So while civil rights has sort of been hyper identified with, say, Black Americans, civil rights was really a fight for all Americans. The Voting Rights Act was a fight for all Americans to be part of the citizenry. And I think we lose that sometimes and we forget that because we do have this sort of zero-sum mentality when we talk about things like rights in participation in the broader body politic.
Al Sharpton said that I have only one grandchild, my grandson, 4 years old, growing up in the world where he'll have less rights than I. What do you think he means by this? Is this an example of the right way or the wrong way to address this issue? And do Black Americans or people of colour have less rights now than they once did?
Well, look, I think when you look at the ways in which the the Voting Rights Act, excuse me, has been gutted, I think we can say that. When you look at the way that gerrymandering has happened in Alabama, that's been a big fight. Or when you look at the voting rights legislation that is passed in Georgia, I mean, I think there is some modicum of truth to this. I mean, when you think about the fact that Black people only have had full voting rights in this country since 1965, and here we are in 2023, where we're still having people having to fight over, real ID laws or having their signatures challenged, I think that's something that we have to pause and stop to think about. My mother was 18 in 1965, and so she is looking at the world from a person who understood Jim Crow, who understood that sort of racism that Dr. King was talking about in this speech and that Reverend Sharpton was talking about today, and to see the rollbacks that have happened in her lifetime next to those really important gains, I think it is a moment for us to pause and reflect and be afraid, because this is not just hyperbolic. When you're talking about literally fighting for your life, when we look at Black unemployment, when we look at Black life expectancy, there are some real challenges here that have not gotten better in those last 60 years. And so I think we have to be very real about the challenges that still face the majority of the lives of people of color in this country.
Concerning, but lots of work to do. Niambi Carter, so great to get your insight. Thank you for joining us on the program today. Associate Professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland.